The B-29 pilot who saw Vietnam's deadliest trap from the sky, the B-29's cockpit shuddered through humid Vietnamese air, while warning lights cast red shadows across instruments that trembled with each thermal updraft from the jungle canopy 24,000 feet below. Through the bombardier's window, I watched something that shouldn't have been possible. An entire section of dense tropical forest simply opening like a mechanical flower, revealing geometric patterns that had been hidden beneath decades of carefully cultivated vegetation. American soldiers who had been advancing with textbook precision just seconds earlier were suddenly falling into spaces that hadn't existed moments before, their radio transmissions fragmenting into bursts of panic that carried across restricted frequencies like prayers offered to a god who had stopped listening to anything human beings had to say. The jungle floor behaved like a living organism, sections of earth tilting and rotating with mechanical precision that exposed underground architecture so sophisticated it seemed to violate basic assumptions about what guerrilla forces could accomplish using primitive tools and limited resources. Smoke columns rose through the canopy from vents that appeared and disappeared according to patterns that suggested careful engineering rather than natural processes, while the sound of distant machinery carried through air thick with humidity and something else, something psychological that seemed to penetrate our pressurized cabin and reach the crew compartment where 4 men sat in absolute silence, knowing we were witnessing something that would be erased from every official record except the one stored permanently in our memories. Through binoculars, I could see individual American soldiers disappearing into spaces that closed behind them with the finality of mechanical systems designed by minds that understood warfare as architecture, creating 3-dimensional battlefields where conventional military doctrine became not just ineffective, but suicidally irrelevant. The restricted radio frequency crackled with voices I recognized from higher headquarters, discussing acceptable losses and plausible denial in language that suggested institutional preparation for events that were apparently proceeding according to expectations that hadn't been shared with operational personnel. That trap wasn't supposed to exist. But I saw it open. If you want the truth they tried to hide, stay until the end and subscribe. To understand why I was there that day, we need to go back to a farm in Kansas, where a 15-year-old boy first heard the sound of aircraft engines cutting through prairie silence and looked up to see a formation of B-17 flying fortresses banking over wheat fields that rolled toward the horizon in waves of gold and green. That boy was me, and from that moment forward, everything else in my life became preparation for the day I would command machines that could carry American power to any point on Earth where enemies threatened values we had been raised to defend without question. My father raised winter wheat with the methodical persistence of a man who understood that some challenges required patience rather than force. Working soil that had supported our family through the Dust Bowl and the Depression while teaching me lessons about persistence and adaptation that would prove more relevant to military aviation than anything I learned during the recruitment campaigns that swept through rural communities as America prepared for conflicts in places most of us had never imagined existed. The local airfield was nothing more than a grass strip where crop dusters and mail pilots would land occasionally for fuel. But to my young eyes, it represented connection to possibilities that transcended the geographical limitations of wheat farms and small-town life. I spent entire summer afternoons watching those agricultural pilots work, learning that flying wasn't just about controlling an aircraft, but about reading conditions that existed beyond normal human perception. Wind patterns invisible to ground observers, weather systems that could be sensed rather than seen, mechanical rhythms that meant the difference between successful operations and catastrophic failure. When the Army Air Forces began recruiting aircrew for the B-29 Superfortress program, I enlisted before my 18th birthday, motivated by patriotic duty, but driven even more by dreams of mastering machines that represented the pinnacle of American technological achievement. The recruiting sergeant, a weathered man named Thompson, who wore his campaign ribbons like they carried more weight than they should, looked at my test scores and agricultural background before announcing that I qualified for pilot training on the newest and most advanced bomber in the world. Advanced training brought me to my first B-29, and the moment I saw her sitting on the ramp at Walker Army Airfield, I understood that everything before had been preparation for this encounter. She was a technological cathedral, her aluminum skin catching Kansas sunlight and transforming it into something that seemed to transcend mere industrial achievement. Everything about her suggested power held in perfect balance. The four Wright R-3350 engines that could carry enormous loads to altitudes where human survival required artificial support. The pressurized cabin that allowed operations above weather systems that grounded conventional aircraft. The sophisticated navigation equipment that could find targets anywhere in the world with mathematical precision. Learning to fly her required months of training that went far beyond basic aviation skills, mastering systems so complex that understanding them completely demanded study approaching academic intensity. But more than technical competence, flying the B-29 required psychological preparation for participating in warfare conducted at scales that challenged individual comprehension. Missions lasting 12 hours or more, carrying ordnance loads sufficient to alter strategic balances across entire theaters of operation. The crew that formed around our aircraft came together through the random process of military assignment. But we became something more than the sum of our individual specializations. Lieutenant Parker, our navigator, could calculate positions anywhere in the world using celestial observations and radio beacons, while Sergeant Rodriguez, our radio operator, monitored frequencies that carried communications between forces engaged in conflicts we could observe, but not directly influence from our operational altitudes. It was Rodriguez who first heard rumors about underground facilities that Vietnamese forces had apparently constructed in areas where American ground operations had reported unusual casualties and equipment losses. The stories were always second-hand, passed along through informal channels by ground personnel who claimed to have witnessed tactical situations that seemed to violate basic assumptions about what guerrilla forces could accomplish using primitive engineering capabilities. But such rumors seemed inconsistent with intelligence briefings that emphasized enemy limitations in heavy construction equipment and technical expertise. How could forces operating from jungle bases create underground installations sophisticated enough to threaten American military operations? The disconnect between official assessments and unofficial accounts created psychological pressure that affected everyone involved in air operations over regions where ground units had reported anomalous tactical situations. The mission briefing that revealed the truth began in a windowless room at Utapao Royal Thai Navy Airfield that smelled of mildew and coffee, with intelligence officers who spoke in euphemisms designed to convey enormous amounts of information while avoiding direct statements that might be recorded or remembered accurately. Colonel Matthews, who had replaced our usual briefing officer without explanation, used language that seemed calculated to create specific impressions without providing factual details that could be verified through independent sources. He described our target area as a high-risk zone, where recent reconnaissance had detected restricted movement patterns and classified enemy structures that required specialized observation, using capabilities available only to strategic aircraft, operating at altitudes that provided comprehensive battlefield perspective. The coordinates placed us over jungle terrain in Tai Ninh province, near the Cambodian border, where enemy infiltration routes had been operating with apparent immunity from conventional interdiction efforts. But the briefing included anomalies that created unease among aircrew who had learned to recognize institutional preparation for operations that exceeded normal parameters. Radio frequencies were restricted to emergency communications only, while post-mission debriefing procedures would be conducted by personnel who weren't identified during mission planning sessions. Most significantly, we were instructed to avoid sustained visual contact with ground operations, while maintaining optimal observation altitude for comprehensive tactical assessment. Weather conditions were described in terms that emphasized ground visibility rather than flight operations, suggesting that our primary function was observation rather than ordnance delivery. The ammunition load was minimal, defensive rounds only, while fuel calculations allowed for extended loitering over target areas that seemed inconsistent with conventional close air support missions. Flight planning included contingencies for emergency communication procedures that weren't explained during the briefing, while crew assignments had been modified to include personnel with specialized qualifications that seemed unrelated to routine bombing operations. Everything about the mission suggested preparation for witnessing something specific rather than accomplishing conventional military objectives. The flight to the target area took us over landscape that seemed designed to conceal whatever was happening beneath vegetation so dense that major construction projects could proceed without being detected through normal aerial reconnaissance methods. Rivers carved brown scars through endless green canopy, while occasional clearings revealed evidence of previous military operations, bombing craters that were already being reclaimed by growth that seemed determined to erase human presence from regions where conventional warfare had failed to achieve decisive results. As we approached the coordinates, radio traffic from ground control began including references to American units operating in the area according to schedules that had been coordinated with our mission timing. The reconnaissance platoon was described as conducting routine patrol activities in terrain where intelligence reports had identified possible enemy supply routes connecting border areas with operational bases deeper inside South Vietnam. But underlying the professional efficiency of military communications was tension that suggested psychological pressure affecting everyone involved in ground operations. Individual transmissions carried emotional undertones that seemed inconsistent with routine reconnaissance missions, while coordination between ground units and higher headquarters revealed confusion about tactical objectives that should have been clarified during mission planning. Ground control vectored us into a holding pattern at 24,000 feet, high enough to avoid anti-aircraft threats, while providing comprehensive observation of developments that were apparently proceeding according to expectations that hadn't been shared with operational aircrew. The B-29 maintained course and altitude automatically, while crew members monitored instruments and communication frequencies that carried increasingly fragmented reports from American forces operating in jungle terrain below. Initial radio traffic suggested normal reconnaissance activities proceeding according to established procedures, with the platoon advancing through terrain that offered numerous tactical advantages for forces equipped with superior weapons and communication equipment. But as they moved deeper into areas where previous units had reported anomalous tactical situations, their transmissions began reflecting psychological pressure that exceeded normal combat stress levels. Individual soldiers started reporting movement beneath the jungle floor, sounds that suggested mechanical activity occurring in spaces that shouldn't have existed according to intelligence estimates about enemy construction capabilities. Squad leaders described terrain features that seemed to shift position between observations, while equipment began experiencing simultaneous failures that occurred with timing too precise to be attributed to mechanical coincidence. Then, the trap activated. From our altitude, I watched sections of jungle canopy open with mechanical precision that revealed underground architecture so sophisticated it challenged basic assumptions about what guerrilla forces could accomplish using available resources and technical expertise. The Earth itself seemed to rotate and tilt according to patterns that exposed geometric spaces that had been hidden beneath decades of carefully cultivated vegetation designed to conceal rather than camouflage. American soldiers who had been advancing with textbook tactical discipline suddenly found themselves falling into chambers that appeared and disappeared according to mechanical systems that operated with the precision of industrial equipment. But these weren't crude pit traps or simple booby traps. They were components of a three-dimensional battlefield that had been engineered to exploit American tactical doctrine by creating situations where superior firepower and equipment became not just ineffective, but actively counterproductive. The sophistication was breathtaking and terrifying in equal measure. Tunnel systems opened and closed according to hydraulic mechanisms that had been powered by underground streams, while camouflaged observation posts provided perfect fields of fire against personnel who found themselves trapped in killing zones that had been designed with mathematical precision. Smoke generators created concealment that channeled American forces toward predetermined positions, while mechanical systems triggered secondary explosions that collapsed escape routes with timing that suggested automated coordination. But what made the trap particularly devastating was its psychological design. American soldiers weren't just being killed, they were being systematically disoriented through sensory manipulation that destroyed their ability to function as effective military units. Sounds were amplified and redirected through acoustic chambers that created false impressions about enemy positions, while visual deceptions used mirrors and artificial lighting to create tactical situations that didn't correspond to physical reality. Individual Americans reported being separated from their units despite remaining within visual contact, as if the jungle itself was creating psychological barriers that made communication and coordination impossible even over short distances. Others described equipment that functioned normally until critical moments when failures occurred with timing that seemed deliberately calculated to maximize psychological impact while minimizing opportunities for effective response. Radio communications fragmented as squad leaders lost contact with subordinate elements who were apparently experiencing different versions of the same tactical situation. Platoon commanders struggled to coordinate responses to threats they couldn't identify or locate, while higher headquarters received reports that contradicted each other so completely that tactical assessment became impossible through conventional military analysis. From my position in the B-29, suspended between earth and sky in a machine designed to deliver strategic destruction with industrial efficiency, I found myself witnessing warfare that had evolved beyond anything anticipated by American military doctrine. The Vietnamese had created not just fortifications, but psychological weapons that could destroy military effectiveness without requiring direct combat engagement with superior American forces. The trap wasn't designed to kill American soldiers. It was designed to drive them insane through systematic sensory manipulation that exploited weaknesses in human psychology that normal military training didn't address. Personnel who managed to escape physical dangers found themselves carrying psychological trauma that rendered them incapable of effective military service, while those who remained trapped experienced breakdown so complete that rescue became impossible without risking additional casualties. But perhaps most disturbing was the recognition that the trap's effectiveness depended upon detailed intelligence about American tactical doctrine and individual psychological profiles that could only have been gathered through systematic surveillance conducted over extended periods. The Vietnamese hadn't just built an underground facility, they had created a comprehensive psychological weapons system that demonstrated understanding of American military culture that exceeded anything our intelligence services had attributed to enemy forces. The radio traffic from ground units revealed the complete scope of what was happening below our aircraft. Personnel were reporting tactical situations that violated basic assumptions about physical reality, describing spaces that seemed larger inside than outside and corridors that led to locations that couldn't be reached through normal navigation methods. Equipment functioned according to principles that seemed designed to create maximum confusion, while providing minimal effective capability against enemies who remained invisible, despite apparently being present in overwhelming numbers. Individual Americans began requesting immediate evacuation due to psychological trauma that exceeded their ability to maintain military discipline, while medical personnel reported symptoms that didn't correspond to any documented combat injuries. The breakdown was spreading through American forces like a psychological contagion that affected personnel regardless of their previous combat experience or specialized training. Higher headquarters responded with confusion that revealed institutional unpreparedness for tactical situations that exceeded the parameters of conventional military planning. Orders were issued and immediately countermanded as officers struggled to develop responses to threats they couldn't identify or understand through normal intelligence analysis. References to operational anomalies and terrain irregularities suggested institutional recognition that something was happening that couldn't be addressed through conventional military methods. The restricted radio frequency crackled with transmissions between senior officers who were apparently coordinating responses to events that had been anticipated at levels far above operational planning. References to acceptable documentation and controlled exposure indicated that the presence of our aircraft wasn't coincidental, but represented careful preparation for witnessing something that would require official management rather than conventional military reporting. But most chilling were discussions about psychological containment and personnel management that suggested institutional planning for dealing with survivors who might carry memories of experiences that exceeded official acknowledgement. The trap had been designed not just to destroy American military effectiveness, but to create witnesses whose accounts would be so incredible that they could be dismissed as products of combat stress, rather than accurate descriptions of enemy capabilities. The emergency frequency suddenly activated with calls for immediate medical evacuation and specialized psychological support that suggested casualties extending far beyond conventional military parameters. Personnel who had demonstrated courage and competence in previous operations were requesting removal from duty due to trauma that exceeded anything documented during previous conflicts in the region. If you want more stories, they tried to erase, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from. The flight back to base was conducted in absolute silence that seemed to affect our entire crew in ways that became apparent only during post-mission procedures that involved personnel I had never encountered, despite extensive service in Southeast Asia. Routine tasks that normally required minimal attention demanded conscious effort that suggested psychological pressure none of us were equipped to process without institutional support that clearly wasn't going to be provided through normal military channels. The debriefing involved officers who seemed more interested in ensuring that we understood security restrictions than in gathering intelligence that might prevent similar incidents in the future. They used careful language about operational compartmentalization, and tactical misinterpretation, while avoiding direct discussion of underground installations or psychological warfare capabilities that exceeded official parameters for Vietnamese technical resources. Colonel Davidson, who conducted the primary debriefing session, was someone none of us had encountered before, despite months of service at multiple facilities in the region. He spoke with the measured precision of a man who had developed questions designed to elicit specific responses, while avoiding topics that might reveal information exceeding our security clearances or compromise ongoing operations that remained beyond our need to know. All references to underground construction or mechanical systems were handled through procedures that seemed designed to minimize official acknowledgement of their existence or significance. Our observations were described as terrain irregularities and visual anomalies that could be attributed to atmospheric conditions or equipment limitations, rather than accurate descriptions of enemy engineering capabilities. Personal equipment that might have recorded visual or audio information was confiscated and replaced with official reports that summarized our mission in language so sanitized that anyone reading them would conclude we had conducted routine reconnaissance over jungle terrain where minimal enemy activity had been observed. Crew logs were collected and substituted with documents that bore no relationship to the events we had actually witnessed. Security agreements were required that restricted discussion of mission details with personnel who hadn't been specifically cleared for access to information we had gathered, while rotation orders were processed that would permanently separate our crew before we could develop coordinated accounts of what we had observed. The institutional response suggested recognition that certain kinds of knowledge created liabilities that exceeded any intelligence value that might be gained through normal debriefing procedures. In the weeks that followed, attempts to gather additional information about underground installations or the ultimate fate of personnel involved in ground operations were redirected toward conventional topics that bore no relationship to the questions we were actually asking. References to psychological warfare capabilities or innovative enemy tactics were met with reminders about classification levels that precluded detailed discussion of operational methods or strategic implications. Medical evaluations revealed stress indicators that resembled combat fatigue, but without the physiological markers typically associated with exposure to conventional military threats. The psychological profiles suggested trauma that had been precisely targeted to exploit individual vulnerabilities while creating symptoms that were difficult to treat through standard military medical procedures. The nightmares began months after my return to civilian life. Quiet dreams, where I circled endlessly above jungle clearings, while geometric patterns opened and closed beneath triple canopy vegetation that had been transformed into mechanical systems designed to swallow human beings without leaving evidence of their disappearance. In these dreams, I could hear individual voices calling for help from spaces that existed below ground level. Young men whose courage and training had become irrelevant when confronted with enemies who understood warfare as engineering rather than combat. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of carrying such memories was the recognition that conventional military responses were not only ineffective against psychological warfare tactics, but might actually increase their impact by demonstrating the irrelevance of technological superiority when confronted with adversaries who understood human psychology deeply enough to exploit weaknesses that existed below the threshold of conscious awareness. The trap I had witnessed from altitude represented evolution in conflict that challenged fundamental assumptions about how modern wars should be fought. While the institutional response to our mission report suggested that American military doctrine contained vulnerabilities that couldn't be addressed through technological improvements or tactical modifications. Some problems required acknowledging that enemies possessed capabilities that exceeded official willingness to confront such realities honestly. Sometimes, when news reports mention underground facilities or psychological warfare techniques, I find myself wondering what other installations remain hidden beneath vegetation that appears natural but conceals engineering projects that represent decades of careful planning and construction. How many American military failures have been attributed to equipment problems or tactical errors, when the real causes involved capabilities that exceeded the parameters of official intelligence estimates? The burden of witnessing events that officially never happened carries responsibilities that extend beyond military service or patriotic duty. Sometimes it means preserving knowledge that challenges comfortable assumptions about American technological superiority while maintaining institutional memory that exists outside official channels, because those channels weren't designed to handle truths that exceed political willingness to address uncomfortable realities about enemy capabilities and American vulnerabilities. Some traps close once, others close inside you forever.